Welcome, everyone, to the second week of the term for FLIRT, the Friday Light Informal Research Talks series. My name is Garrett Richards, and along with Daniel Nadolny and Jennifer Buxton, we are the FLIRT Committee. If you're joining us for the first time, FLIRT again stands for Friday Light Informal Research Talk, and the idea is for us to showcase research going on at Grenfell and involving Grenfell partners, and sometimes even research done by non-Grenfell folks. But we try to do it in a way that research will be presented so that it's accessible to folks in other fields and to the general public. So that is from the light and informal part of the acronym. So today we have Billy Newell, who's an assistant professor with the business program here at Grenfell, and the presentation will be What's in the Sauce, How to Share Sensitive Information for Early Stage Ventures. A couple of other things before we get started. I should mention that the FLIRT series is supported by the Offices of Engagement and Research here at Grenfell. And if you're interested, you can also get onto our mailing list and we'll tell you what each FLIRT presentation is going to be every week. So I'll maybe put my email in the chat, and you'll be able to grab that if you want to get onto the mailing list. And of course, if you are a researcher at Grenfell and you're interested in delivering a FLIRT presentation, please get in touch with us. And we have plenty of spaces available this term for folks to do their presentations. So without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Billy. Welcome, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. I especially like, and I'm going to fully practice the light and informal part of this talk, hopefully. Of course, I think this is scheduled for an hour. I'll just give some relief to everyone that I'm not going to take that long. So I'll try and keep it, like I say, fairly brief, but also in the spirit of, this discussion is try to have everyone kind of come away with something interesting that they've learned, something fairly practical and hopefully actionable, especially if you find yourself in the position that the entrepreneurs find themselves in, or the entrepreneurs that are the subject of this kind of conundrum find themselves in. And so, and again, thanks for introducing me. So it says William Newell here. I guess already I'm forgetting the informal part, but everyone, certainly call me Billy if you have any questions or anything like that. I also believe that there's questions at the end. I think that's how it goes. Yeah, perfect. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to address those near the end. So this paper, or the presentation, as I said, is called What's in the Sauce. This paper, with a much more boring title, has been submitted and is under review at the International Journal of Technology Transfer and Commercialization. And so you'll kind of see how that relates here in this particular presentation. I should also say that there is a co-author on this paper, which is Dr. Jacqueline Walsh. She is working out of, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the law clinic. I don't know if she's here. I hope she's not, but it's basically a law advising clinic for startup ventures. And so this was kind of what gave us the inspiration to look at this paper like this. And of course, Jackie, being an intellectual property lawyer, is the one who kind of gave us a lot of the background into the law side of things here. That didn't come from me. So she's also advised me to say that also means I'm not a lawyer, and some of the things that we discuss here, which do refer to legal precedent, you should not really take as legal advice from me in any sense. So this is simply sort of a brief kind of summary of what we found in the Canadian law context associated to this particular problem. But nonetheless, it should be quite useful and interesting, again, especially for those at those early stage ventures. I also saw that Professor Turner joined us. I'm also going to show in this presentation that there is still a place for clip art when trying to talk about a story and set up your research. And so I'm hoping that she'll be shifting kind of uncomfortably in her seat right now as I say that. But anyway, I'll begin. So, what's in the sauce? And this is all about how to share sensitive information for early stage ventures. So I will, yeah, basically just continue on here. And we start our clip art and image journey here. We have a very happy person. This is our entrepreneur. And so as we know about entrepreneurs, these are individuals who are pursuing some sort of opportunity, some sort of commercial opportunity, and trying to start a new business. And so a lot of times they have some kind of idea. So we have our entrepreneur here with a fantastic idea, an opportunity that they'd like to pursue. And in this case, we could say that very literally, as the title says, it is some sort of recipe for a new sauce. But the sauce, of course, as we all probably have guessed, it doesn't necessarily have to apply to this, but this can apply to any kind of intellectual property or some sort of information that can be deemed valuable and sensitive. And so this type of information comes in many different forms. Of course, in the case of recipes, these can't be patented, but we may have certain technologies or inventions where we can file intellectual property patent protections. But of course, as we know that in these early stages and when there's just an idea and when entrepreneurs just start beginning to work on these ideas, a lot of times they haven't gotten that far yet. And so this is kind of where we find ourselves in that entrepreneur's journey. And so let's just say, you know, they have started this business selling their sauce and they started to make a little bit of money. And they start getting even the more crazy idea that they could really make a go of this business and that they would like to get some sort of outside investment, let's say. They don't have the money to grow this business, and so they're looking for some sort of venture capitalist or some other private investor to try and take this business to the next level, so to speak. So in walks our evil venture capitalist. I happen to really like Kevin O'Leary sort of as an entertainer, but I think he's always sort of this pop culture embodiment of the shark or the dragon. And so in walks this venture capitalist, or perhaps, of course, the entrepreneur has walked into their dragon's den or their shark tank or their boardroom and tried to, if they were lucky enough to get this meeting, tried to discuss a potential deal with this venture capitalist with regards to an investment in their company. But of course, this venture capitalist is also very, very much looking forward to making some money here. And I think also, once again, Mr. O'Leary provides a really great example of that. And so we have both people who are kind of pursuing their own different goals in relation to starting this business. So the entrepreneur says, you know, I've got this sauce company and I've been doing pretty well. So may I please have some money? You can, of course, have a certain share of my business, or perhaps, you know, there's some sort of royalty agreement. There's all kinds of different ways that you can structure a deal. It could even be potentially a loan. But in essence, I would like some money. That's the bottom line. And I would like you to invest in my sauce business. You get this frozen stare from the venture capitalist. They seem to be playing their cards pretty close to the chest in terms of what they think. But of course, they're going to have many questions for you. One of them may be, well, what is in that sauce? What is, or of course, this also is a representation of the question around what is in that technology that you're trying to sell. I would like to understand a little bit more about the inner workings of your product. I would like to understand a little bit more about the technology behind your product. Maybe it's about a particular software. How does that work? And this is a natural question to ask because, of course, as we've discussed, this entrepreneur, this venture capitalist, sorry, wants to make some money. And they're also usually very smart. And so they don't want to just simply invest their money with anybody. But we also know that in the case of certain types of information, we aren't sure if we should be giving away our secret sauce recipe or if we should be divulging this type of information. And this leaves the entrepreneur in a little bit of a conundrum. And they say, oh my gosh, I'm a little bit uncomfortable doing this because I know, especially if we're in the case with a sauce recipe, I don't really have any protection or any guarantee to say that this venture capitalist who has a lot of money themselves and could potentially start their own SaaS company, or potentially they meet with all kinds of other entrepreneurs and they could kind of give away my secrets, I don't know what I should be telling them. I know maybe a good idea, for example, might be to get them to sign some sort of non-disclosure agreement and to say explicitly through this contract, you can't disclose any of that information. And so that seems like a good idea and potentially a good solution. In essence, it is. But what we see a lot of times happening is the venture capitalist says, oh, you know what, I'm a busy person. I meet with hundreds of entrepreneurs every month. And look at me, I'm big and I'm important, and everybody wants to do a deal with me. There's no way I'm signing this. You know, I might have lawyers that advise me against signing these documents because who knows, I may stumble across this idea, or I may, you know, kind of adapt from this idea to come up with something a little bit different. And there's no way that, you know, just this idea that you have or this information that has no intellectual property protection, there's no way that I'm going to bind myself to this. And they often kind of start off a little bit annoyed. Then they might even get a little bit angry and say, you know what, I thought we were going to have a nice working relationship and that we were going to trust each other, but you're throwing this contract in my face. So I don't really want to do this deal with you. And I don't really want to sign that non-disclosure agreement. And we can see that this happens. There's lots of examples of this, especially even like anecdotally and kind of the entrepreneur pop culture references and things like that. So this leaves our entrepreneur in a further conundrum again. So they must say, well, I really want this deal. How much do I reveal about the SaaS? How do I protect my information if this deal goes south, if this deal goes badly? And they might say, well, I wish I had intellectual property protection. And then, of course, the barriers to getting this intellectual property protection might be that it takes a lot of money and expertise. It also might take a lot of time. And we should also know that some of these deals are time sensitive. You may not get a second meeting with this venture capitalist if things aren't going well the first time. And so you kind of wish there was something else in place to try and to protect all of this. And so our research question around this paper essentially was, how do entrepreneurs share sensitive information during this early venture formation process? This wordy slide, I'm sorry, so it kind of drives this point home. So the decision as to how and when to disclose confidential information is very prevalent as the startups seek market validation, which is a way of trying to test their ideas to make sure that they're actually desirable by their customer segments. It's also prevalent when they're engaging with funding sources like venture capitalists or other private investors. If we're trying to look for other complementary assets to make partnerships, these are all cases where the entrepreneur might be faced with this particular situation. And it's very uncertain for them. So the vulnerable group faces a high level of uncertainty and risk without any alternative but to share it. So oftentimes there has to be some sort of degree of sharing that occurs, but we know that there are many situations where this is happening and the entrepreneurs are in a particular area of risk. I should also note that, you know, this, again, we're trying to address early stage ventures, and these are also situations where it could be that the entrepreneur simply doesn't have a legal team or an expensive lawyer to try to work on filing some sort of intellectual property protection. From the literature perspective or the academic literature perspective, this also kind of puts us a little bit different from a concept that we call kind of open innovation, where companies are much more public and try to seek as much input as possible from diverse sources around their different innovations in their product development. These are usually companies that are larger and usually companies that have some sort of innovation strategy. Again, when we're talking about early stage ventures, we're talking about individuals and we're talking about businesses that haven't gotten there yet. However, a lot of times they're still on the cusp of needing this type of market validation, financial support, or some sort of partnership to help this idea move forward. And so what this research paper has done, it's been entirely, it's been conceptual, leaning mostly on some of the gaps in what we know about trying to manage these situations. And as you'll see, it has incorporated the Canadian legal context. And so what we have done in this paper is we have argued that the solution to figuring out how much information to disclose can be summed up in a practice or a term that we've called legally informed information disclosure, or LID. No relation to keeping a lid on it, although I thought that that was pretty funny when I first thought of the word. I'll probably see you insert your eye rolling emojis into the chat as you may. However, this term, as we said, kind of summarizes a set of practices that we've come up with, informed by research in the area and by precedent in the Canadian legal context, to try and help solve this conundrum that I'm talking about. The definition that we've come up with, so again, it's conceptual and it's been based on essentially some legal arguments. So legally informed information disclosure is the sharing of sensitive and valuable information through means that, with the legal environment in mind, clearly indicates its value and confidential nature before and during the process of the disclosure. So this is something that should start even before the information disclosure should take place. And this includes practices that a startup with limited financial resources and time resources should be able to implement. So this can be very practical for those startups. And I'll also discuss how this adds to like the academic discussions and things like that as well. To really summarize those principles right up front, I'll be talking about the three of them that we came up with in this paper, which is about practices that internally treat information as valuable. We will see that you have to at least show internally in your company that you value information and that you are treating it as such. And so there are certain ways inside the company you should be labeling and handling this information before you even find yourself in situations like the one we've seen with our entrepreneur and with Mr. Wonderful in that particular discussion. We'll also talk about that you need to share on a need-to-know basis, and we'll talk a little bit about how the legal system in Canada kind of classifies this. And then as you're sharing, you can place certain safeguards there to try and denote the value and the confidential nature of the information without explicitly putting this non-disclosure agreement in the face of a venture capitalist, which, as we say, sometimes what we see happen is when that happens, it can kind of disrupt the formation of that relationship. Our term lies on from a theoretical and from an idea stance. It lies at the intersection of three kind of broad areas. And so the first two up top were what we call relational and contractual governance. And so basically what these means is they represent two different approaches for governing or managing a situation where you're trying to monitor and control the activities of another person. And essentially, these views say that on a relational governance side, we can say that, well, this really incorporates the idea of trusting someone else, where you might say, hey, if you trust someone and you build kind of a solid long-term relationship with that person, you can not necessarily control what they do, but I mean, you can work with them and be very confident that they're not going to act against your best interests. The other ways that we can do this type of managing of another person's situation is through the contractual governance. And these are usually through contracts or things like formal agreements. And so in the situation of sharing information, this is where we might talk about the non-disclosure agreement. This is where we might talk about having other kinds of really formal safeguards in place so that someone, again, doesn't act opportunistically and potentially share that information or do anything that would cause harm to us or our business. And what the literature and what we know is that it's really hard to figure out how these two forces, this relational governance and this contractual governance, it's really hard to figure out how we balance that. It's really hard to figure out in all these different situations when we should be employing each type of strategy, whether that be trust or contracts. And this can, of course, change based on how long we've known a particular person. And it's a bit of a fuzzy relationship here. And we don't always know the answer, and the research hasn't really told us or given us a solution, especially in the particular situation that we're talking about here. And so what we have suggested in this paper is that, and what other authors have suggested in this area, one reason why it's kind of so cloudy and so this answer is not clear, it's because we're not taking other environments into consideration. And in this particular case, the environment that we're talking about is the institutional one, or a subset of that institutional environment is the legal perspective. So what we've essentially argued is that to really understand this idea of legally informed information disclosure, we need to take all three of these different aspects and overlap them to really kind of focus in on developing this concept. And so once again, we've taken these kind of three areas in theory and then built the argument for why this idea of legally informed information disclosure is good for business. I'm in a situation here where I don't even see the time, which is a rookie mistake. So someone can also even just let me know how I'm doing for that. Be great. Thank you. So as I've said, we've talked about trust and we've talked a little bit about contracts, and we can talk a little bit about how they overlap. So trust falls under the relational governance, and very quickly I'll say that it just means guiding behavior through self-enforced rules and norms like trust. Trust is the key component here, which is why I've highlighted this. And it's basically like an actor A's belief that actor B will perform actions that results in positive outcomes for A and not take unexpected actions that result in negative outcomes. And so when we have trust, of course, we know that we're much more free to share this information. It's no problem. So if you trust someone 100%, you know that you should be able to disclose whatever sensitive information that you may, and that you're very confident that nothing bad is going to happen. It is oftentimes said that this is the superior means of governing a lot of these different exchanges because, it's also very cheap because we don't have to worry about things like drawing up contracts. We don't have to worry about things like how do we monitor this person to make sure that they're doing what it is that we want. So like, how do we keep following up for that venture capitalist to say, are you still not sharing my information? Remember that conversation we had? You don't have to do any of that. And so we say trust is a really good way of governing this type of exchange. And in the paper, we talk a little bit about how this is formed. But one of the toughest parts about trust in a situation like this, of course, and perhaps everyone has guessed this, if this is the first time we've met someone, the simplest thing that we can all observe is that you may not trust them at that point because it's an incremental process. And a lot of times we may not have time to build that trust, especially if we're having these meetings with certain venture capitalists that are very busy and they think they're very important, and then they only want to see, entrepreneurs one at a time and one meeting at a time. So this is where we introduce the other governance mechanism. And so it has been recognized that, it might be that you need to set up some sort of agreement to get yourselves off on the right foot. You might need to have some sort of contract. You might need to have some sort of non-disclosure agreement. And this is oftentimes what's been recommended, in literature on new business relationships between larger organizations and things like that. So the control relates again to these formal legal safeguards that outline the behaviors and responsibilities and obligations of the parties in a new business relationship. So this is where you actually codify, monitor, and put in safeguards against these different types of wrongdoings that might happen in the relationship, or this opportunistic behavior that we call it. Or in this case, just leaking that information to people that we don't want. The problem is, of course, anytime there's a contract, anytime there's an agreement, we start to introduce more ambiguity. We start to introduce more costs. These contracts are often not complete. And this, of course, is the case when we have new entrepreneurs who don't really know necessarily what they're doing. And so we see that on the one hand, those contracts can be incomplete. And on another, and this is where I'll kind of introduce the plus sign and their overlap, we also know that when one party is insisting that a contract be signed, it can start to alter or it can actually produce an atmosphere of distrust in a particular relationship. Of course, we might have seen or experienced, or like in, especially in movies and TV and stuff, if we're talking about marriage and we talk about prenuptial agreements, if you've got one person who's insisting that this be done, a lot of times it might still be a very smart move to do, but you also run the risk of kind of fostering some kind of atmosphere of like, well, hey, well, what do you want me to sign that for? Like, don't you trust me type thing. And so these can work against one another and against trying to establish a really good relationship. And we've seen this happen, and the research has shown this in a number of different examples about business-to-business relationships and interpersonal relationships as well. And so the literature also discusses things like, well, are these two things substitutes then? Are they complementary? And kind of the research is out, and there's all kinds of different arguments and contextual kind of factors that play in here. But it's probably the relationship between these two things are probably a lot more nuanced than what's being suggested so far, which is why, again, we've introduced a legal perspective to really bring home and to develop our concept of legally informed information disclosure. And to do that, we've relied on an area of law called the breach of confidence. As you may detect, the way I'm speaking, this is where I'm starting to step out of my comfort zone in terms of the background, but I'll do as best I can to try and clearly talk about this. When we talk about a breach of confidence, of course, this is the area of law that talks about when one party essentially makes unauthorized use of another party's confidential and proprietary information. So this cause of action is based on the laws of equity and available to a party with or without the presence of a confidentiality agreement. And so the important thing to realize there is, especially for the situation of startups, is that there doesn't necessarily have to be a confidentiality agreement in place. When we're talking about the breach of confidence, though, a confidentiality agreement is the easiest way to prove the existence of such an agreement, that information was disclosed in private and then confidential information was disclosed in private. But a non-disclosure agreement or a contract isn't necessary. So what then has to happen is the entrepreneur, in the case of approaching the venture capitalist, has to prove to a court, if it ever went that far, and to show that they can protect their information, they have to meet this three-part test to show that there would have been a breach of confidence if the venture capitalist actually shared that information. And the three-part test is what you see here. So the information itself has to have a quality of confidence about it, which we'll discuss a little bit further in the next slide. The information must be communicated in the circumstances to which that obligation of confidence arises. And then the information must be actually misused by the potential partner in some way. I will focus on the first two because, of course, the idea of the legally informed information disclosure is about protecting the information from being misused. And so that's the bit I'm going to expand on rather than go too much into the third bit. And I should also note that the three steps that I presented before are linked to the practices involved here. And so when we talked about the quality of confidence, you need to protect your information internally in your company. And you also should protect the information as you choose what to share. And so as you're sharing information internally, if it's the recipe to your sauce or whatever, mark it as confidential. Let other employees or let other parties know that this is something that shouldn't be shared. Along with that, of course, you need to really think about how secure this information is and who can actually access the information. The non-disclosure agreements are the ones that can be saved for your employees and not necessarily the ones that are being implemented towards the venture capitalists. And finally, the information, as we say, is disclosed on a need-to-know basis, which I'll talk a little bit about more on the next slide. So this is about, sorry, I gotta go ahead in my own slides here. So it's basically only sharing what absolutely needs to be shared internally to that company. Sorry, that's the need-to-know internally for any employees involved. And so this information you'll also see is these are about steps that a company can take even before getting themselves put in the situation of having to share the information with an external partner. And what this does, again, if we refer back to that test, is it shows us that the company itself has treated this information as valuable. If a company hasn't, then you're more likely, if you find yourself in a situation as the entrepreneurs do, the venture capitalist shares the sensitive information, it will be harder to prove that there was a breach of confidence in that particular case. And the second part of the test is about you have to share the information in a particular circumstance, in a particular setting, and so in which an obligation of confidence arises. And so basically the courts are going to look to determine whether a reasonable person standing in the shoes of someone receiving this information, would they realize that the information being given to them is confidential? And once again, the non-disclosure agreement would make that very obvious. But in the cases where we don't want to spoil our relationship with this non-disclosure agreement, you can try and share the information in a situation that promotes this obligation of confidence. And so the courts will look at things like the relationship of the parties involved. They'll look at things like the background of industry trade practices. They'll talk about how the description of the information is during the disclosure. Is the entrepreneur describing it as confidential? Is the entrepreneur describing it as a trade agreement? Are they putting these labels on the information? All of this should be done to prove that there would be a breach of confidence. And again, the more proof that you can provide of this knowledge of confidentiality through documents or conversations and having witnesses, the more likely that you'll be able to prove that this information was shared in a circumstance which promoted an obligation of confidence. And the information that we use to try to build on these cases, you can see from these two slides, the court cases are noted below. They're very interesting reads in among themselves in terms of how they've given precedent to these rules. And so that's also kind of a really interesting read, and we go through that in the paper in a little bit more detail, but I won't do that today. A couple of things I'll just touch on briefly that the court would look for is, again, the measures taken by the company to secure the information, the value of the information to owner and competitors, the amount of money or effort used to create the information. And this kind of relates to the adage that ideas are a dime a dozen. So again, if you came up with an idea, you haven't done any work around actually seeing this idea through or validating this idea, and you tell someone and they tell someone else about this idea, you go to the court and they're probably going to say, how much effort did you actually use to come up with the idea? And if you just say, oh, this was an idea I had, you don't have a very strong case in this particular circumstance. And then, of course, we want to talk about the level of difficulty in which the information could be obtained or duplicated by others. This is somewhat related, but again, very different to the one previous. So I know I've just kind of talked about those, but kind of very briefly. And then there's a lot of other legal things around there that again, as I'll admit, I don't have a huge amount of expertise in. But essentially, what we've hoped that, from a theoretical perspective, we want to argue that this idea of legally informed information disclosure is something that is new. And we believe, as I said, it lies at the intersection of trust and control, or relational governance and contractual governance, and introducing the legal perspective with the breach of confidence to try to argue for why this should be something to be considered in future academic research, and to do some more testing on it and to do some more studies on it. From a practical contribution, we've got the three kind of legally informed information disclosure principles. You'll probably note that this doesn't completely cover you in these types of situations. And those practices, again, as we see here, is internally treat information as valuable, share on a need-to-know basis, and place safeguards during sharing. This doesn't completely keep you covered, and this still kind of leaves you open to that interpretation of what is a need-to-know basis, what information really needs to be known in this particular case. However, the reason we've called it legally informed information disclosure is because, at least when you undertake these practices, you as an entrepreneur have some knowledge in what the institutional context, and especially in the Canadian legal context, how they look at this type of sharing of sensitive information and how they would treat a breach of confidence should you find yourself in that position. What I'd like to know a little bit more about for future research and things like that is about, what types of perceptions does this type of behavior I guess, suggest towards a venture capitalist. So on the one hand, if you put, as an example, so if you put a contract in the face of a venture capitalist and this turns them off and says, I thought we were going to build a trusting relationship, I don't want to sign this. What type of image or what type of, image of yourself or impression does it give when you are able to kind of walk this legal fine line, so to speak, and to implement these practices really well? Does it show that you're being responsible? Does it show that you're probably someone, a smart entrepreneur, a good entrepreneur to do business with because you are aware of these different types of things? And so I think that would be really interesting to see in future studies. It would be really nice to be able to do more legal studies on whether or not this has happened, but we actually don't see a lot of cases that we have access to about this kind of stuff. But it opens up a lot of different avenues for research. And as I've said, I really hope that for anyone listening who might need some of this from a practical perspective, I hope it's kind of put you on the right path. But once again, I'll also finish off with saying, if you have the luxury of talking to a lawyer, luxury, so to speak, you should do that. This was not legal advice. Again, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. Thanks again.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Billy. Really interesting stuff. I like the different concepts that come in here and there, and it reminds me that, political science and law are not always that far apart. So I appreciate the way that the concepts have been put together, and I appreciate the practicality of thinking about the example of an entrepreneur. So thanks for all of that. I don't see any questions on the WebEx chat or the Facebook chat yet, but I'll ask a question. And it's continuing on from those comments you were making at the end, because I really found that early example of the venture capitalist who rolls their eyes when you want to protect your intellectual property as an entrepreneur. And I was wondering, and I guess you started to talk about this, but it sounds like the LIDs, this would be a helpful resource for assisting entrepreneurs in knowing what sort of their legal rights and obligations are. But as it stands right now, we don't know how helpful they would be in that sort of situation in terms of trying to improve the relationship with the venture capitalist rather than potentially damage the relationship. Is that right? Is that you said that we need more information about that before we really know whether it will help address that problem?
Yeah. So essentially, what that means is a lot of this information is really useful in preparing for a meeting like that. If you find yourself there, it's probably too late if you haven't kind of taken those steps. In terms of helping the entrepreneur decide what information to share and not necessarily how to share it, that is a little bit more of a gray area still, and also partially because every situation there will be different, and so admittedly, yeah, there's still a big gray area around what information to share when discussing early stage ventures. And it's less about that and more about how to share it.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Billy. Julie has a question. So yeah, Julie, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Oh, I'm seeing now, I'm just looking at the icons here, Julie, and it looks like maybe your mic isn't connected. Oh, that's looking better. But it says you're on mute.
Can she unmute herself, or does?
No, I don't think we have to do anything. What it looks like to me is like, no, we can't hear you. It looks like we can see when you're on mute, but then when you turn it off, instead of there being a green mic, there's nothing, which suggests that there's some sort of connection issue. But if we can't figure that out, you could type a short version of your question. That might be the best that we can do. But we'll give you a moment to figure that out. Sure. Okay, go ahead, figure that out, Julie. I will ask another question.
Sure.
So I guess this is a little bit more of a broader consideration, but obviously it would be nice for entrepreneurs to be able to access this sort of information and understand, their sort of rights and responsibilities when it comes to the legal framework. But I was wondering, just really broadly, I suppose this is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but if someone is an entrepreneur, how do they know where to go to get this kind of information? Is there some sort of central resource that's often available in different jurisdictions? Or is it, sort of a truly independent venture where, there's not necessarily a lot of centralized support?
Yeah, I don't think there is a whole lot of centralized support for these types of problems in particular. In some cases, like I say, there are a lot of nuances that then require kind of a legal expertise from a lawyer. Also, the other reason that I think that there isn't a really good kind of support system, Jackie Walsh, who's the head of the law clinic with the Dalhousie Law School, I also know that she has been contacted by several other people in discussing how this clinic works and what it all is about, because it's actually, I think, quite a unique setup. That clinic essentially would provide this advice to entrepreneurs to let them know of their kind of legal rights and responsibilities. But so that's an interesting place to go, but I don't think that that's very common. Your only best kind of information source would probably be to brush up on your intellectual property kind of overview, and not necessarily the legal aspect gets boring. And of course, it isn't boring. I think it's interesting, but for someone who's just trying to dive into it without any guidance, how do you do that? That's difficult. I don't know. The intellectual property stuff is something that you can brush up on, and that's just trying to, figure out what can you protect, how do you protect it, and things like that. So if you kind of just look at that in the Canadian context, you should be able to find information like that as well.
Great, thanks. So I think Julie is going to try again, and then I also noticed that Daniel has his virtual hand up. So Julie, go ahead and give it a try. If you are talking, we can't. Oh, there, she's got a text question. So I'll read it out in case people watching the stream can't see the chat. So it says, Billy, do you think most entrepreneurs who have protectable ideas or products or processes are aware that they should take steps to protect their intellectual property? And where or when should this thought be introduced in the process of seeking funding, for instance?
Do you think most entrepreneurs? Do I think that they're aware? I think that there are some cases where it's more obvious and that they are, and I think this kind of may relate from one industry to another. I think there are some cases where it's less obvious and so that they aren't aware. And I'll try and find some examples as I go into the second part of the question. Where and when should this be introduced in the process of seeking? I think this also depends a little bit on the idea. One example I can think of is if you're an entrepreneur and you happen to be in like some deep science and biotech, and you've got really leading edge, cutting edge ideas, something that you can patent or something that you need to protect. The general consensus there, I think, is that you should play those cards really close to the chest, because really consider that right from day one and not disclose much information at all. Because if you remember the examples about the effort that it took you to get that information, it was a lot. And although that can help protect you against a breach of confidence, the other downside, of course, is you have to go to court and stuff like that. And how, it's much more than difficult to get compensated for something that took so much effort to produce. And again, this we can see very clearly, or not clearly. Well, we could probably imagine that for cutting edge technologies and cutting edge research that takes a lot of time and money, this is something that should be considered right away. If we're talking about ideas that are on the other end of that spectrum, a bit more about the ideas are a dime a dozen, and we haven't spent any time developing that yet, you're probably a little bit safer to disclose those ideas because you don't really have a hope in hell to protect it at that point anyway. So but again, it can be a little bit more dependent on those situations. I think that's the best way I can summarize it. I hope it was an okay answer. Again, I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, but that's my best style on that.
I noticed that Julie is also posting about this. I think I remember seeing a headline about this as well. A recent accusation against Tim Hortons stealing an idea that came from a father-son team. It sounds like it's timely, and this sort of thing happens where you get these disputes over intellectual property.
It certainly does. Tim Hortons is the biggest concern there. Without reading the article or knowing anything about it, of course, it doesn't look good when you are being accused of stealing from a father-son. If they've got like a coffee or donut recipe or flavor or something, it doesn't look good. It's probably more of a bad PR issue for them to damage their already struggling brand.
Yeah, I think it was about some sort of special cups that would allow the servers to like pass without contact or something. I can't remember what it was. Tim Hortons started doing that, and there was this team that said, "Oh, we invented that first. They stole it." But I guess in that sort of situation, they have to prove that if they don't have a patent, they have to prove somehow that Tim Hortons got access to that information and then acted maliciously on it.
Yes, that's right. And that they were told that information. Those 3 steps that they were told that information in a situation where they should have been obligated to keep it confidential.
Right, because unless you have,
go ahead.
Unless you have a patent, if you're sort of out there saying, "Here's our technology" to people, there's no expectation that idea is protected. If there's no patent, then there's no non-disclosure or protection agreement.
Right. So in the case of a special design of a cup, from what I do know about IP laws, that's probably something that could be patented if it was unique and met all those different criteria. The other side of this, of course, and this is something that we would like to discuss a little bit in the paper. These patents and things, it gives you the right to defend your intellectual property. It doesn't give you a grant. Someone doesn't just say, "Oh, you're right. Tim Hortons can't use that cup." Like, you still have to fight Tim Hortons in court to get that. It just gives you the right to fight it, and it kind of puts that intellectual property on your side. But it can still be a costly battle, and these are things that can be considered potentially shortcomings of what we've talked about here. Because by the time you get to the court trying to prove this, you're already in a mess, right?
Because if you go to court and all other things are equal, the venture capitalist is likely to win over the entrepreneur, given that they have greater resources.
Tim Hortons is definitely in a better position to draw out this type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I know that Daniel has a question or a comment. So go ahead and unmute your mic, Daniel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great. So one of the questions I had was actually what you were just talking about there, which was since venture capitalists do have more financial resources, it seems like if things do go to courts, that still could put the entrepreneurs at a disadvantage. So even if they're using this kind of framework or process, does that solve the problem with potentially these the entrepreneurs being taken advantage of? And for that, I guess that would require an examination of how these things play out in court. The other question, so maybe you already talked about that a little bit, but the other question I had, you mentioned bigger companies sometimes take this other approach with kind of open innovation and sharing information and being able to draw from multiple people. And I can imagine the level of openness being a continuum. And it seems like there'd be a trade-off between things being really open and being able to get lots of insight and feedback from family, friends, people in related areas or fields and that kind of thing. Then what you're talking about here, where if you take that approach, then you're maybe less able to defend your intellectual property or trade secrets or whatever it is that your innovation has been. So is taking this approach where you treat this information as very valuable and have documents marked as confidential and be fairly restrictive, does that reduce entrepreneurs' abilities to get for innovation from that could come about from having things more open? Like, is there a trade-off there, or is that not really the what happens or what could happen?
That's a really good question. The short answer is I don't know entirely. So if I understand correctly, so you want to there's a trade-off with keeping things secret to try to keep all the advantages to having information kept confidential unto yourself, and there's advantages to having everybody access the information so that you can use their insight and their expertise to engage in this more open innovation bit. Yeah, I suppose it would be. It is a trade-off. I don't know all the nuances about how that trade-off would go. What I do know is that there has been a fair bit of research around this idea of what they call selective revealing, and so what this is usually in the case of larger companies who have the open innovation strategy. Oftentimes, the smaller entrepreneurs don't have that strategy for open innovation, but what they will do in a selective revealing sense is they will reveal like part of their technology or part of their innovation, and they spend a lot of time, depending on what that technology is, to figure out what they will disclose to kind of let people innovate with that, and then they do take a fair bit of time to know what information they're going to keep to themselves. And so this type of strategy has been employed by these types of companies to try and see how they can get the best of both worlds there. You should, if you're interested, there is a paper by one of the authors is Aman Salter, and it's called Cui Bono, I think, selective revealing something or other. It's a very interesting topic, that is, but I don't know enough about it to say more than that, I don't think.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I didn't know about that area or approach, so that's fantastic. Thank you. I forgot to mention I've enjoyed your talk too, so thank you for
thank you.
sharing. Working on. That's fantastic.
I don't see any other comments on WebEx, and I don't see any on Facebook. I just took a quick look at the article that Julie shared, and my thought is that potentially that father-son team would have benefited from this information. I've only done a quick skim, so I don't know if the article says everything about exactly how much was shared and what sorts of agreements, but it does sound like there's some sort of some vagueness or confusion around sort of what the expectations were, and whether there really was a non-disclosure agreement and that sort of thing. And then is it possible that Tim Hortons could have, or someone could have independently come up with a very similar design? There's questions about that, which I guess courts ultimately have to decide these things, right? If it's not a clear and overt admission of guilt, and it's just sort of, well, it looks like they copied our design, we think that they did. I guess the court has to weigh the balance of probability there.
And if it's something that they patented, well, that they have something. But if how often do we hear about something? Oh, I had that. That company A did this. I had that idea long ago. Obviously, again, you don't have a leg to stand on if you have this kind of parallel innovating happening here, where one party hasn't taken the steps to protect it. And if there was no breach of confidentiality, if there's no sharing of information, there can't be a breach either from the perspective of legally informed information disclosure. So from the perspective of this paper, there would have had to have been that exchange of information as well. If they just happen to come up with a similar design, and then there has been no intellectual property protection and no information disclosure by the others, my guess would be that they were the first ones, Tim Hortons were the first ones to do it.
Right.
But I don't know.
It's
I have no idea about that situation other than what we're
yeah, I know, and I'm finding myself wanting to dig into the situation as well, not knowing that much about it either.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, and I think the application of what you're mentioning here and these tools and the lid is something that would be relevant, that sort of thing. So it's neat to see that kind of applicability. So yeah, I don't see any other questions, and I mean, I don't think it hurts us to end a few minutes early in case folks have other meetings at 1:30 or something like that. I've put my email in the comment section for both on WebEx and on Facebook in case anybody wants to be added to the FLIRT mailing list or would like to deliver a FLIRT. And that stream will stay up on Facebook. So if there are others who are watching this on recording and you want to post a question there or email Billy, I'm sure that you could, and he would be happy to respond. I guess I shouldn't volunteer him, but
We have Daniel and Janice and Julie here. I don't know who else is watching live. I'm sure I'll answer emails from those three, and then anyone else. I don't know, anyone else who's on Facebook Live and stuff like that. Yeah, sure, that's fine
Right.
as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Billy. All right. Well, thanks everyone so much. I'll leave it up to Jen to end the stream.
Yeah.
But
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, and yeah, look forward to seeing the recording. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Billy.
Bye.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
You
See
too.
ya.
See you.